Just Engineering Super Angle Kit.
So a little while ago, I picked up this angle kit from Just Engineering, their AE86 Super Angle Kit. And I want to talk about, do kind of like a technical breakdown, talk about all the different bits and pieces and why I thought this was fantastic and a huge upgrade for me. And I think it's a huge upgrade for a lot of people who are trying to be competitive and competitively drifting their AE86. So, I went down to Clutch Kickers about a month ago, and it was an eye-opening experience. I realized a lot of shortcomings, not only with my car, but also with my driving. And one of the shortcomings with my car was the angle kit that I'm running. I've been running essentially reduced Ackerman power steering knuckles with 3-inch extended lower control arms. And I did this for two reasons. One was for maximum amount of lock, and also for, I wanted a wider track width. I kind of modeled it off a WiseFab. The wider front track width gives you a little bit more stability at higher speeds and when you huck the car in. So that's why I went with such a wide track width, in theory anyway. But the problem I ran into is a bunch of the alignment specs aren't the greatest, so I sacrificed alignment specs for angle, and it just, it's worked really good for me. I've actually really liked it, but like I said, Clutch Kickers is eye-opening. So let's talk about this angle kit, the AE86 Super Angle Kit from Just Engineering. For a lot of AE86 people, this is way overkill. You will never need this because it's super wide. I think it's like 3 to 3.5 inches extended over stock LCAs. So super wide track, a ridiculous amount of steering angle. It's just kind of overkill for typical AE86s, So let's just get this out of the way real quick. People who say AE86s don't need a whole lot of angle. Well, really what it is if you drive with a whole lot of angle with a low power car like an AE86, it's going to slow you down too much. So what happens is your vehicle speed isn't moving fast enough, you don't have the power to power out of a high angle situation, and so on. It causes you to straighten, stall out, angle stall, whatever you want to call it, you have issues. However, for higher power cars or for tracks where you can enter with a higher speed, you can make use of the steering angle to slow yourself down. Instead of having to, throw the car and then use the brakes or whatever to throw it down or to slow down, you can throw a little bit more angle, and then the car will naturally slow down because of that. So it's pretty cool for like super aggressive entries and things like that. But you don't need this angle kit to get a lot of angle. Really, I think angle kit might be a bit of a misnomer. It's more about drift geometry. So it's maybe a drift geometry kit or a drift steering and suspension kit, drift suspension geometry kit. I don't know, something along those lines. So let's talk about that a little bit, and then we'll go into the specifics of this kit. So a car that's set up for road racing is not set up for drifting, because you turn, let's say you're turning this way, you turn to the left, and then the road forces are going to go this way, okay? So a typical road race setup isn't going to be set up for that, because for drifting, if I'm going to drift that way, I'm going to throw it in and steer the opposite direction, and then the load's going to be this way. So a little bit of a difference in how the steering suspension is loaded, the different alignment angles, and so on. So because things are a little bit different for drifting than they are for road racing, you've got to change up how the car is set up. So let's talk about this kit. Okay, first things first, let's talk about what makes this an angle kit. Then we'll talk about the things that are more adjustable that makes it more than just an angle kit. So steering angle for a drift car mainly comes from steering radius, right, which comes down to this relationship between the ball joint and the tie rod end, okay? So you've got that. Then you've got how much steering rack travel you have to be able to move that knuckle, okay? So that comes from inner tie rod end spacers or, things of that nature, steering racks that have more travel versus less. Okay, so those are two things. And then the next thing that comes into play here is clearances. So, for example, clearance with the tie rod end, because you'll have, as you turn, or not the tie rod end, that's the tension rod. So there's clearance with the tension rod, right? So as you turn more, right, your wheel is going to come in and it's going to hit. So that's another thing to think about too. So let's talk about the relationship between the ball joint and the tie rod end. You can see here, this is a stock power steering knuckle. This is what most people use on AE86s to get steering angle, and that's a pretty significant difference in length. So you've got a much faster steering ratio here. Now, let's talk about, this doesn't come with inner tie rod end spacers. It's all about clearance. So, if we look at the clearance here, right, we've got this curve to the control arm here. So that way, it makes room for the tie rod end. So the tie rod end doesn't hit immediately, right? Because if it were a straight line, it'd hit here, and we still have a lot more room to go, okay? So that's one thing. Now, they also have this adjustable angle stop here. It's a threaded bolt. You got a bunch of different spacers in it, and even with those spacers, all the spacers, that is an insane amount of steering angle. That is probably more than what you need or what I will need. Another neat thing for clearance on the knuckle is this chamfer cut right here. So, without having a roll center adjuster built into the knuckle, you can't have this chamfer cut, and what that does is as you go to lock, right? So what ends up happening is your tie rod ends up at a pretty aggressive angle, and it actually will hit on the knuckle. So like on a stock knuckle, it'll hit on it. So yeah, that extra little bit of cut there actually gives you a good amount of extra clearance for angle to run, reduce, zero Ackerman, whatever. So yeah, that's super cool. I don't know of a single other steering knuckle on the market that does that. The other thing here, another thing with clearance, like I said, we got tension rod, we got the clearance here, so that's really what makes this an angle kit. But what makes it more than an angle kit makes it a geometry correction kit, a drift geometry kit. We'll start here by looking at this tie rod end. Actually, we'll grab the other knuckle here too. So if you see this knuckle, there's this nice machined slot here, and that's too big for a tie rod end. But what you have that goes with it are these guys. These are Ackerman adjustment shims. I think there's only one or two other knuckles on the market for an AE86 right now that has adjustable Ackerman, and these are really fine-tunable. So they've got a little notch on them, so that designates, which, let's see if you can see that here. You got that notch there, so that designates how much Ackerman you have, right? So you can adjust the Ackerman, and then you come to the 4. It also helps designate, forward or back, make sure you're all facing the right direction, and make sure you got the right ones, because different ones have a different count of notches in them. Now, Ackerman, the reason why we talk about Ackerman with drifting is that if you're looking from the top of a vehicle and it's turning, right, the circle for the inner wheel, if we're turning a full circle, is going to be smaller than the outer wheel, right? So the wheels are actually turning, this is over-exaggeration, but the wheels are turning at a different angle. So that's kind of what Ackerman has an effect on. Now, in terms of drifting, you're drifting sideways, but you want to be going that way, so you want the wheels pointing in the same direction. If you don't have reduced Ackerman or whatever, you're going to have one wheel dragging it. It's going to cause some issues, tire wear and wheel speed and some other stuff. So with zero Ackerman or reduced Ackerman, you can, it's going to steer better. It's going to feel better, and drifting will carry speed more easily, better, whatever. Now, some people don't like perfectly zero Ackerman, and another factor, or one of the things that comes into effect with Ackerman, is not only a relationship between the tie rod end and the ball joint and where that tie rod end ends up on the knuckle, but also your steering rack location. So you may have to play with these shims a little bit to get what you want, and the great thing is that they're easy to swap out, so you can be at the track, make changes, and go back out and drive again and see how the car feels. It's awesome. Super awesome design, okay? So that's adjustable Ackerman. We talked about angle. Let's talk about the length of these. So these are, like I said, 3 inches or so extended. Here, let me move these things. And then we're going to flip this guy around. Here we have a 2-inch extended lower control arm for an 8.6. So even with this 2-inch extended, you can see the difference here. So ball joint is about right here. So you've got, you get about 1.5 inches. So yeah, these really are like 3.5 inches, 3 to 3.5 inches extended. Now, when you extend them that much, it's great. Gives you really great feel. The car just reacts really well. You get great handling from the front end of the car at high speeds and when you're hucking it super aggressive. But the problem that you have is you get so much negative camber because you cannot bring the upper strut mounts out wider. On my car, I have 3-inch extended. I'm at -8 degrees of camber, and I have my camber plates max as positive as possible. Now, the Just Engineering kit comes with these things, which are freaking awesome because they're further out, right? So mine pretty much stops right here. So this way, I should be able to get reduced camber, better camber, because -8 is too much. That's awesome. The only problem is you got to notch your shock tower for this. So that kind of sucks, but you got to work around it. Another cool thing about this is you've got multiple hills here, so you can actually rotate it a little bit for a caster adjustment too. So that's super cool. You can get some caster out of these. That's pretty neat. Now let's talk about caster adjustment on this even more. Caster on these arms is done with these guys here. So this is where you've got different spacers, big spacer, or small spacer, big spacer, and then you also have these like this is a little bit easier to see. You've got a big guy and a little guy here. So depending on how you have this position, it's going to change your caster because it's going to be the whole control arm forward or back. So there's a little bit of a downfall, I think, because you can't fine tune it like you can the traditional AE86 adjustable tensioner rods, which are just a threaded bar essentially. And then you can infinitely adjust it. So there's only so much adjustment, but it should be okay as long as your car is pretty straight. The last thing here, I guess, is roll center correction. So when you lower your car, your ball joint angles sometimes end up at an extreme angle. So we're going to use this guy to look at, say, if this was like your control arm, right? So as you, like a normal car, you've got a little bit of an angle, so your ball joint ends up sitting kind of like this, all right? But as you lower the car, the ball joint ends up at the opposite extreme. So as you hit, or as you go over bumps, that ball joint cannot go any further, and this causes bump steer. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's the general gist of it. So the way to fix this is with roll center adjusters. So typical roll center adjusters for 8.6s, they go in between the knuckle and the shock strut, right? So they go right here, and it spaces it out. What that does is that pushes the knuckle and the control arm down to give you better ball joint angles with, not only the ball joint for the control arm, but also the tension rod. What Just Engineering has done is they built the RCA roll center adjuster into the knuckle itself. So you got this big fat knuckle compared to the stock one. You got your roll center adjuster built in. Now, additionally, what they've done is they've taken the tie rod end and the ball joint and given these some roll center adjuster. So the ball joint, you've got a small spacer and a large spacer. So depending on your car setup and all that stuff, you can swap these around and get different roll center. You should probably also have room to put some washers on either end to move it if you wanted to, but I'm not at that point yet. The tie rod end, you've got the same size spacers here, these guys that go, on both sides of the joint, but then you've got washers here that you can use. They're not just washers. They are like a precision machine washer. It's not just like a standard cheap washer. So that's pretty great. So you can adjust your roll center with that. So that's 3 different ways that you can adjust roll center with this kit. Now, something that I feel like a lot of AE86 people overlook is scrub radius. So a lot of people will use a negative camber roll center adjuster. So instead of the strut bolting directly on top, you've got this NC RCA that bolts to the knuckle, and then, let me see, I got to think about this a little bit, and then the strut actually bolts further out. So what that does is as you turn, it gives you negative camber through the steering sweep, which is pretty good. The problem is it destroys scrub radius, which when you're driving a manual steering rack car, when you have that extreme of a scrub radius, steering is going to be much more difficult. It's going to be harder to turn. So what they've done is, let's see if I can see it. I don't know if I'll be able to see it on this one, but if you look at the position here of the shock holes and the actual hole for the ball joint, let's see if I can get it lined up. So it's kind of hard to see it, but inside of there, let me see if I can, I really hope you can see this, but I can see it, and what they've done is they have moved, it looks like they've moved the ball joint hole just, let me see, there we go. They've moved it just a smidge. So what that does is that reduces or corrects scrub radius. AE86s are notorious for having bad scrub radius because you use a low offset wheel. And it pushes it pretty far out. So scrub radius is the relation of your shock to your kingpin inclination, and then, so if you draw a center line on the wheel and a center line on the strut, and where those points meet at the ground, right? So depending on where they intersect, if it's right in the middle, if they're one way or the other, it'll be positive or negative. I forget which, but essentially you get such an extreme scrub radius of the AE86 that it causes increased steering effort, which can be a problem, right? So you couple that with something like extreme caster. So most 86s run like 3-4 degrees of caster. On my car, I ran 6 degrees, and that increases steering effort. So when you got high caster and you've got these crazy scrub radiuses from negative camber roll center adjusters, you get some serious problems with how difficult the wheel is to turn. So this corrects that, I think. Anyway, that's the theory, and that's what I'm theorizing. But yeah, this should be pretty awesome. You know, there's 2 cars that are running this kit already, so I think I'll be a third as long as I can get the car together. So this corrects, let's talk about it. So we got angle, a ton of steering angle, corrects clearances and all that stuff, all right? We've got caster adjustment. This is not super fine tunable, but a good enough range. We've got camber correction for the wide stance. The wide stance gives you a better steering feel, in my opinion, or suspension feel for entering at high speeds and hucking a car in. You've got triple adjustable roll center. The one thing that is kind of missing from this is the sway bar. So from what Just Engineering was saying is they're working on something to be able to add a front sway bar for customers that want it. However, they may not need it. I guess because of the track width change and how much roll center adjustment there is and all these different things, you may not need a sway bar to get that same kind of feel. So we'll kind of play it out, see how it goes. I mean, there's some science to it because YFAB and things don't typically run sway bars. So I'm really excited to see how this feels. Another thing that I forgot to show, these are all steel construction, and this is 3/4 inches thick. This is beefy. It's not breaking. It's not getting damaged. There's no way that this is going to break unless I do something seriously wrong. Which is good, because I know a lot of people are worried about flimsy control arms, because having all these cutouts, people are worried about it, but I'm not. All right, so I hope I did that whole explanation justice there. So we've got a ton of increased steering angle, which isn't necessarily a benefit you need for Corollas, but for high power, or if you want to enter super aggressive and scrub speed and then back out of it, that'll do that. And I'm actually really excited about that for me, because at Clutch Kickers, the entry, I'd have to huck it and carry angle through it, and it was just really difficult because I didn't have enough angle or my car wasn't set up well for it. So this should give me that. And I have a lot of steering angle. I don't necessarily need more, but there are certain situations where I could use it for fun, not necessarily for any performance advantage. Now this also has, because it's a triple adjustable roll center adjustment, it's got great caster setup. It's a little different, but I'm excited to see how it goes. This is the standard for most angle kits. We've got camber adjustment for the extended control arms. The extended control arms give you a lot more stability for hucking the car in. So these are all the things that I'm thinking about. They're gonna be pretty great. I'm a little concerned about not having a sway bar, and my only other concern is being able to fine-tune caster. My car, I changed the tension rod mounts, or where they bolt onto the front. So I'm a little worried that I may not have been precise enough on that. Well, we'll see how it goes once I get on the car, see how precise or how good my fabrication skills were, to see if it's good enough to have pretty straight, caster from side to side. That's pretty much it. I'm just super excited, man. This should be pretty sweet. This is a huge upgrade for me in my car. Is it necessary for everybody? No. Is it necessary for even most 86s? No. This really, I think, is going to benefit people who are trying to compete at a higher level, who are trying to compete and keep up with higher power cars or Formula D cars or whatever you want to call it. So for me, this is an advantage that I can have on my car that other 86s haven't had yet. So yeah, make sure to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. The next video I put out about this angle kit will be installing it, and then I'll also be testing it at Rockingham Speedway. There's a 2-day MB Drift event for Halloween Havoc on October 23rd and 24th, so I'm gonna get some great feedback on what I think of it, and then I've got Just Engineering pretty much on speed dial to help me sort out any problems that I have at the track, so that way I can make the most out of it and give you guys the best, I think, review of this kit. Do it the most justice, because this is a new kind of setup for 8.6s. This isn't something that people typically do, and I'm really excited to give it a go.